welcome to the afternoon session. I know I'm usually the one between you and a coffee break, so it is what it is. Also, I heard the internet is down and we're having a cybersecurity talk. It wasn't us, I promise. It was not us. That is not part of the show. So what is this about? I'm going to do a little bit of storytelling with a few of you here. Are you an owner-operator? So do you have an industrial environment you're responsible for? Well, then let me just tell you a couple of stories about security in OT. Let's get started with who we actually are. So the company name is Dragos. We are a global company. We're based out of Hannover with one N, so the small Hannover, on the East Coast in the United States, outside Baltimore. But we have subsidiaries across the globe, including here in Germany. So Dragos Germany, GmbH, is a thing. We're roughly 540, 50 employees. Most of us have 10, 20 years background in OT. And we know a little bit about cybersecurity. We're in 11 dozen plus different industry verticals. So we have expertise actually in those verticals, including oil and gas, electric, manufacturing, food and beverage, transportation. And we've been doing this for a while. So we're 8 years old now. We call ourselves a technology company. This is why we're also partnering here with AWS. So shout out to the Amazon guys. But as a company, we actually build on 3 pillars. So front and center is our product called the Dragos platform that allows you to visualize and identify the assets in your OT environment, map threat detections over that, and then have some playbooks that tell you actually what to do once you see something happening. But that, of course, gets informed by the other 2 pillars that drive the uniqueness of what is Dragos. And that is our world-class threat intelligence team. So we actually do have a team that tracks threats against OT, exclusively that. So yes, we have people that figure out and track how adversaries are targeting OT environments, not just the computer systems, but also the industrial processes that drive your manufacturing or production processes. And we have a services team, which I am part of. I lead the global incident response team that proactively and reactively supports our customers in their cybersecurity journey. So starting with architecture reviews, tabletop exercises, threat baseline assessments, these kinds of things, but also, of course, when a bad day happens, my team comes in and supports you during your worst day. Those of you in the know, when it comes to OT, and you might have had a conversation or 2 with your IT people already, do understand that things are a little bit different between IT and OT. The simplest way that we usually put this is, in OT, we have all the fancy toys that you guys have in IT, plus some even fancier toys. Just on the other hall, when you go to hall 16, they have the huge Rolls-Royce engine standing there from an airplane. I love these things, right? That's what we got. And then we have this thing called physics that makes interacting with an environment just a little bit more interesting than in the IT world, right? What's the stuff that is still moving in an IT data center? There's 2 things. Who has an idea? What moves in a data center apart from the employees? The fans and the doors, right? Everything else is solid state. There's no moving parts anymore in a data center. Well, go to a hot strip rolling mill. I have 14 years background in the steel industries and 7 years in automotive. So if you go to a hot strip rolling mill, like say an aluminum mill that turns the big slabs of aluminum into what you use to cover the chocolate in, they're moving with a speed of 20 meters per second past you through the rolling mill. So if you stand there the wrong way, you're going to have a really bad day. So physics is what makes life interesting in industrial environments, and thus how you respond and how you detect events in industrial environments also is quite different. The challenges, of course, are also different, right? It requires, as an adversary, quite significant knowledge to have an effect on industrial processes. But on the other hand, big topic here at Hannover Fair, we have this thing called IT-OT convergence, which is allegedly new. So let me do a big spoiler alert. It is not new. This has been happening since 1999 at least, right? When folks started using Windows for HMIs and Linux in their like plastic extruders and stuff like that. So high-tech equipment that started to be run on common off-the-shelf operating systems, but also most of your PLC vendors, if you go over to the automation hall, most of the PLC vendors these days, do they have their own operating systems and runtime environments anymore? Not really, right? Everybody's building on codices, like minus Beckhoff to a certain extent, and Siemens and Rockwell. They have their own stack. Everybody else standardizes on common technology. Everybody standardizes on common network protocols, meaning that is much better for you to leverage your own workforce, right? You only have to train staff in common technology stacks, not your proprietary things anymore, but also adversaries have it a lot easier. They can target what they already know. And of course, targeting is also different. So when you look at the whole risk discussion, what happens when you target systems on the IT side? I mean, this is usually where, especially here in Germany, you're always discussing information security, right? We have long German words for that, Informationssicherheit. Does that really matter in an OT environment? Who of you has valuable data in your OT environments? Probably 1 or 2%, right? If you're pharmaceutical, maybe. If you're high-tech manufacturing, maybe sequencing data, how you your just-in-time sequencing during more complex manufacturing processes, and that is mostly it, right? OT environments are more about reliability, being able to create product or deliver a critical infrastructure service like water, fresh and wastewater treatment, or providing electricity. It is not about somebody stealing your data. So the objective of an adversary targeting your OT environment is entirely different. It's all about sabotage. It is not about stealing something. And the only real sabotage we know from IT is what? Ransomware, right? When somebody destroys more or less your data, it is rendered unusable. That is the only thing we're familiar with in the IT world, that is sabotage, whereas most incidents that target OT are sabotage to begin with. So an adversary trying to disrupt, deny, degrade, destroy your physical process. We come out every mid to end February with an annual report that just summarizes what we've experienced over the past year, including what we've seen in our custom environments, what we've experienced through incident response, and what our threat intelligence team has been hunting for over the past year. I'll show you a few examples, like a little bit of a numbers game of what happened over the last couple of 12 to 18 months. Mostly you can place this in 2 buckets. Interesting enough, because the world's been interesting over the last year, we have raises in both of these important buckets. So bucket 1, organized crime, usually meaning ransomware. Bucket 2, state-sponsored adversaries, right? Somebody targeting you because of a more geopolitical reasoning. So when we look at ransomware, I mean, ransomware has been around for, it feels like ever. Targeted ransomware has been around for at least 10 years, so at least a decade we've been targeting ransomware, so not spam emails, but somebody deliberately targeting an organization because they think these guys are most likely to pay a ransom. They don't have a significant security team that can deal with this. So it is highly likely that there's not going to be a huge negotiation, and for them to be operational again, they will pay rather quickly. Now consider this. If you target an IT environment of an organization that is, for example, manufacturing, how bad is it if your IT environment goes down but you can still make your product? Well, you can't write emails, so your logistics might be disrupted. If your ERP gets hit, that is a problem. But at least you can still make some type of product, right? It might be a little bit hit and miss because you can't deliver exactly what's been ordered if your ERP is down, but you're still operational. When your OT system gets targeted, though, the money machine goes down. Those of you in manufacturing know how expensive that is. I didn't need to tell you that. But usually when we talk energy, so gas and oil, electric, water, you can easily add a couple of zeros per hour of outage to these environments. So this gets extremely expensive very quickly. And then in manufacturing, as well as in especially energy environments, the longer an outage takes, the higher the risk to operations gets, including it gets very expensive restarting these processes. So one example from a case my team worked on last year, there was a ransomware incident at a tire manufacturing plant. the beginning of the week. So it probably started on a Sunday as they were coming back to work to start the Monday night morning shift. And they had just started mixing the product that then gets baked into tires. Some of these pre-products have a very short lifetime. So you have 6 days once you start the mixing process until your pre-product expires. So when you cannot make tires because your whole operational environment just went sideways because of a ransomware attack, you're not only having the loss of not being able to make product, but also you're losing all your perishable pre-product. So that just adds to the cost, and of course you need to clean that up. You need to get rid of any pre-products and residue that might still be in the environment before you can start that. But that is small change compared to some gas and oil environments. So some of our customers that operate offshore assets, when they experience a full emergency shutdown of an offshore asset, like starting that asset takes a year. Imagine if that is one of the most important gas fields that currently supplies LNG to Germany, and that just went out the window for a year, and how awkward the phone calls between that energy supplier and certain governments in Europe might look like. So the stakes are pretty high there. Criminals know that, nation-state adversaries know that, which is why these environments are getting targeted for various reasons. When we look at our cybersecurity report, we see that vulnerabilities tend to get exploited more and more, but most of them actually don't matter. So the good news for OT environments is most of the vulnerabilities you don't really have to patch depending on where they are in your environment, so you don't have to follow the same cadence as IT people, and you have to have that conversation between IT and OT, that sometimes it is more prudent for minimizing operational risk to not patch something. But then there are these exceptions. For example, when something targets your remote maintenance capabilities, your VPNs, well, that you might have to do next weekend, right, during an emergency shift. And if it's Thursday already, going through the motions to establish that, right, set up that emergency maintenance window, can be extremely daunting. So we also have to realize that these patterns are a little bit slower than in the IT world. And usually this is where we see IT-OT conversations going a little bit out of whack because one side doesn't really understand the other and doesn't understand operational constraints and requirements. But again, good news is, don't bother about most OT vulnerabilities with the exception of those that can really hit your crown jewels, so the heart of your operations. When it comes to ransomware, just as I said earlier, we've seen a huge increase, and actually we see that year over year over year over year. So this is a trend that's been going on for at least 4 years. Main reason being, again, as I just said, it is much more effective for organized crime to target manufacturing, especially those small, medium businesses that are the core of the German-speaking part of Europe and Italy. So the DACH/I countries, because you have all these small, medium businesses that are hidden champions in their niches, really good at doing what they're doing, making their product, but they have not that many employees. They might have a standing IT team of 5 people, so it's you 5, right? And one of you just got also appointed the security person. Right, so you got that job 2 months ago. Maybe you can dedicate a day or so per month to that, if even. But how much do you know about OT, right? How much can you do with the OT environment? So you're a very nice target because you have enough money to pay the ransom, but you don't have enough of a security posture to actually be able to deal with that, which is the entire reason why ransomware gangs are targeting this. And then on top of that, of course, thanks to geopolitics, you see a number of ransomware gangs that are actually not ransoming anybody, right? They're just destroying data because they got nudged by one or other nation state to do this just to cause a little bit more mayhem. So the closer your operational environment and what you're making is to critical infrastructure, defense, industrial base, the more likely that this might be part of the targeting process. Let's look at a case study for a typical ransomware attack. This is actually, again, I mean, I could copy paste this for like at least a dozen ransomware cases my team worked on in the last year. But this actually comes from a midstream gas and oil operator. So for those of you not in the know what midstream means, a pipeline operator somewhere in the world. They had a huge ransomware event on their IT side and emergency disconnected the OT operations from IT. Those of you familiar with pipeline operations might understand that that immediately means there's an impact to pipeline operations, because if you don't know what product you need to ship through a pipeline at what time of the day, that quite disrupts your money machine. They had absolutely no visibility into their OT environment, so they were basically flying blind, like probably most of you, most of the time, because hardly anybody these days, especially here in Europe, is monitoring their OT environment, which is one of the things we'd like to change, actually. Luckily enough for their OT environment, they had just 2 weeks before the ransomware case happened, removed the trust between their IT and OT Active Directory. Because the adversary used Active Directory to deploy the ransomware, which is, again, run-of-the-mill, what ransomware gangs do, try to gain access to Active Directory, place the malware as a group policy object, distribute it everywhere. Before you do that, you use Active Directory to shut down the endpoint security solution on all the systems. So you see your antivirus shutting down or your XDR shutting down, and then you see ransomware deployed everywhere. And they couldn't get to OT because of that. I mean, not for lack of trying. They definitely tried, and they tried some other techniques after that. But by that time, we had deployed our Dragos platform visibility and detection solution, and we could guide our customer, the victim, in making a well-educated decision and when it was prudent to reconnect to at least portions of the IT environment. And because in any crisis, there's 2 things that are basically make or break for you to being able to get ahead of the situation. Proper communication in a crisis management organization and visibility, right? If you don't have situation awareness, you're hosed. So quick visibility, providing that situation awareness is actually your job as an incident responder. Usually it's nothing fancy like deep forensic analysis and all those things that you might think make incident response quote unquote sexy. It is very plainly providing situation awareness so the incident commander can make an educated decision on what to do. And sometimes these might be harsh decisions like shut down that plant, disconnect that site. But these things are extremely expensive, so you want to try to minimize that, right? Because that comes at an operational cost. So the more visibility you have, the more situation awareness you can develop for an environment, the higher the chances are that you don't have to go to those drastic measures, right? You can be more targeted in your countermeasures and keep the environment running or reconnect as quickly as possible, minimizing your losses. And that's at the end of the day what we're supposed to do in IT and OT security, right? Supporting the organization so that they can do their job properly and the money machine keeps running. Here's another example. This is more from the nation-state bucket. In January last year, a state-sponsored adversary targeted a central heat power plant in northwestern Ukraine, using a malware that leverages a very common protocol, Modbus. So most of you probably heard of that at some point. To change a specific parameter on a PLC or on a number of PLCs that control the flow of hot water through the heat generation process, through the heat exchangers. So if you were thinking about the Hollywood example of doing that, and you could easily come up with, yeah, let's stop the pumps or reverse the flow and just break the pumps and things like that. No, 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 no. The adversary was extremely subtle. They changed the constant that you need to use in the PLC to actually calculate the temperature, right? Because the temperature sensors give you what? A voltage, some value that has nothing to do with the actual temperature in the water pipe. So you have to run a formula with some constants to figure out what the actual temperature is. They manipulated that. So instead of telling the actual temperature in that water circuit, which went down in January in Ukraine, minus 20, minus 30 outside, so probably quickly went down to 10 or 5 degrees Celsius. Well, the HMIs were still telling the operators it's all hunky-dory, it's still between 50 and 60 degrees Celsius. But imagine what happens when the actual water temperature goes down this much, and you're supplying 400 apartment building and an unknown number of industrial facilities with centralized heat. And just a secondary effect of what happens when water in those pipes turns into sludge in the dead of winter. So welcome to what we now call in the news since 2023 hybrid warfare. This is exactly what you do. When I then presented the findings that our reverse engineers and our threat intelligence team did to some of our customers, for example, in refineries, and I talked to them like, hey, Consider how your sensors operate, how you do readings in your environment. Just imagine if I change these constants in your PLCs, and they will all tell you mayhem will happen. Because this is how sensors operate, and this is such a subtle change that we hardly ever monitor it. And again, if you don't have visibility on the network level into your environment, if you're not seeing when that set point change is enacted, hardly anybody that is not required to have that by regulatory requirements has a sequence of events log. Right? Because that is really expensive to stand up. So your data historian might or might not, and usually it's might not, be able to track these unimportant set point changes, right? Deemed from an engineering perspective, because this never changes past factory acceptance test. Adversaries know that as well. Right, so this is a prime example. Another important part of that is what IT-OT convergence buys us. Until about 3-4 years ago, targeting as an adversary in an industrial environment was kind of a boutique thing, right? You had to target a specific process as it was implemented at a specific site, right? So it was very, very bespoke and could not be reused between different sites, even if they were doing the same thing. So imagine manufacturing process, if I'm targeting robots so they move in a way that they break. Well, it depends on the exact model, how these robots are implemented, how they're used, so it might be very hit and miss. But consider the example with the malware that we call Frosty Goop. We have very highly standardized controllers with a standard configuration that are used in lots of central heating facilities. So you just equip this malware with a configuration package to tell it to change these two registers in all these controllers. So if these environments are pretty much copy-paste, this is a valid attack against a huge number of environments. That is what IT-OT convergence buys you, commoditization. Malware is really only effective when I can use it to scale. Right? When I have to create bespoke malware to target an environment, ask the folks that created the Stuxnet malware in 2006 that between 2006 and 2010 targeted the uranium enrichment facility in Iran in Natanz. That was an extremely expensive, highly bespoke operation that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. That is not feasible for normal adversaries, including state-sponsored. This is though, right? And again, this is the downside of IT-OT convergence. Malware now becomes feasible, so scalable attacks become feasible. And some of you might have read a year ago the reporting in The Spiegel, Guardian, Washington Post about the Vulcan papers. So basically, quick summary, procurement documentation about a Russian company that creates scalability for the Russian military. When I talked to our intelligence team, some of them are ex-military, they told me you would see exactly the same procurement documents if it was the United States buying something from Northrop Grumman. So this was quite legit. And again, this is how this game is played at scale when you're a nation state and you're out-tasking to your industrial, defense industrial base. So what's the focus in OT environments? Because usually at this point, and I also teach, by the way, for the SANS Institute, so those of you that are interested in training, you probably know who SANS are. And I remember when I got started teaching in 2017, especially here in Germany, because engineering and it always has to be perfect. I'm German, so I know I'm allowed to nag my own country folks. It was always, yeah, Kai, we can't do that. We cannot do monitoring in our highly complex OT environment because we cannot cover everything. And I mean, the proper answer to that is entirely besides the point, right? But all of us know the typical security program, right? That who of you has worked on a security program in your environment? Security project, security program, anybody, big corporation here? So I've certainly done that in my past. So how does that work, right? It's planned for a year. 6 months of the year go in, let's call it politely, political negotiations. So you're bitching about budget, staffing, and actual scoping. And 2 more months are a little bit more discussing what to actually do, and then the last 2 months of the year before everything shuts down and you have to provide evidence is actually implementing that. And of course, all the project milestones have to be green, otherwise you're going to be invited for conversations with upper management why it's not green. So you end up with a bunch of security controls spread everywhere that are not really effective. So let's do something else. Let's start with focusing on what an actual threat is. So depending on your industry vertical, that varies, right? All of us have to deal with ransomware. If you're electric, you have to deal with adversaries that know how to shut down substations in a way that they damage transformers and generation, possibly. But again, it's a limited subset, so we can adjust to that. And then let's use security controls that are actually effective against those types of attacks. So instead of spreading something, right, the English term would be boiling the ocean, we add a lot of focus. And then we also don't have to monitor everything. We monitor what we call the crown jewels. So the most critical systems controlling the most critical processes in your environment. So focus, focus, focus. You don't monitor for everything. You monitor for what's most likely targeting these specific processes. And then you create your whole security organization around dealing with that. Responding to that, monitoring for that, proactively trying to prevent that as much as you can. This kind of focus makes you extremely effective. Another quick story before I wrap it up, if you won't believe me, how that can actually be done. So we have a customer, a very small electric utility on the eastern seaboard of the United States, Massachusetts, a little town called Littleton. The thing is, one of their customers is a tiny harbor that is also used by the US Navy, and for them it's kind of important. So that little electric utility was targeted by a state-sponsored adversary about 1.5 years ago. They had deployed our product, the Dragos platform. They were using threat intelligence, and before all of that, before they did any of that, they had actually sent their whole crew to SANS training. So they were well trained in how to defend an OT environment, and then they got targeted and they saw it. But they had implemented some basic security controls, and the adversary wasn't able to pivot from IT to OT. The adversary did try to steal shift documents, maintenance documents, which told us that the adversary was actually trying to learn when they have maintenance mode, how their shifts operate, so it could hide in the benign user traffic, which is quite new for that type of adversary. So the name of the adversary that is used by the Five Eyes countries is Volt Typhoon. So it is a group operating in interest of the People's Republic of China. So if you read the report, if you download it, for example, from CISA or download our report, you will see that exactly what I just said is part of that report. So this adversary is trying to steal shift documents and all of that, but the ultimate aim is to develop initial access into an OT environment. So they're stealing information to access the environment with the ability to then target that when the order comes from up above. But again, this small utility managed to frustrate that adversary to no end because they had proper visibility, proper threat intelligence, and capabilities. And after 3 months, the adversary gave up. So that tells a story about, oh my God, all these state-sponsored adversaries are so powerful, there's nothing we can do about them. Well, actually, you can. Right? Everybody's cooking with water. Everybody's using the same techniques. You can get them. And the same as organized crime. And again, you need to integrate all of that. So if you're lucky, then you have good communication between IT and OT. Oftentimes, there might be some cultural gaps that need to be covered. There might be some ruined relationships that need knitting because back in the day, 15 years ago, IT told OT to patch everything and then operations broke down and people in OT have a long memory. Try to get over that. Invite them, like we're in Germany, invite them for a couple of beers and mend things. Because ideally, of course, you have a unified environment. You're creating a SOC that has IT and OT capabilities. So when something starts on the IT side that, because you're using proper threat intelligence, smells like it's OT, you know how to deal with that properly. And you hopefully then stop it before they're even able to pivot into the OT environment. Right? This is ideally how you would be doing that. Now you can integrate that. And of course, in a lot of environments, we can also provide managed services around that because not everybody has a large security organization, so not everybody can do everything by themselves. So it helps you if your security provider can also do some managed services around that, which is also where AWS comes in. If you're already an AWS customer and if you're using cloud in your SCADA environment and gas and oil, I've been seeing that a lot over the past 2 years, well, that can be very effective in rapidly deploying our solution, at least in part, right? The upper parts, of course, not deep down at the process level, but the upper parts easily deployable. especially when you don't have visibility yet, but you do have an incident. Right, the faster, again, I can create situational awareness, especially during an incident, the more effective I can be. I highly recommend, especially in those situations, to leverage cloud solutions as much as possible. And again, with a partner like AWS, where your regulatory requirements might demand that data does not leave the country or not leave the region, well, thanks to AWS regional data centers, that is a non-issue, right? So again, that kind of scalability, when you need it, especially during an emergency, is usually make or break. And usually this is where we talk in hours, hopefully just days, not weeks or months. One last thing, how do you do this? Again, I don't want to just paint everything black and oh my God, the sky's going to fall and the earth will open, we'll all die. As I gave you with my little example of that tiny utility in Littleton, Massachusetts, if you do the basics right, you can be extremely effective in your security posture, especially in OT, even against very deep pocket state-sponsored adversaries. The thing is though, there's no silver bullet like always in security, right? Just me telling you use the Dragos platform, it's going to be your big savior, wouldn't be true, right? There's certain things you need to do, but you should be using best of breed, right? You should be leveraging knowledge about your environment, knowledge about a threat, and capability to detect and respond. But if you do those basics, and you can download this from the SANS Institute, those basics properly implemented will make you extremely effective in your OT security posture. Actually, the big advantage that we have in OT, the one thing that makes detection really, really difficult in IT, you all, people, is not prevalent in OT. And machines are highly deterministic and highly predictable in their communications patterns. So it is much easier detecting threats in an OT environment than it is in IT. So let's start doing this, because times are really interesting, right? Things are happening day by day by day. If you read the news like I do every morning, there's not a week where you don't read something interesting about hybrid warfare. But this is how you deal with that. With that, thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to visit us at our booth or just hit me up after this, because I've been running over for 2 minutes now. Oh my God. Thanks.